What's up, everyone? It's Dave from the Medal of Honor channel, and it's time to do another episode of 6 Records. As you can see, I'm back in the tattoo shop again. Just had to get some stuff done here early, so I thought why not go ahead and shoot this. This episode of 6 Records is going to be a little bit different. What's going to be different about this is because it's not actually going to be in some order of going from the least to the most or to the worst to the best. There's no actual importance to the order other than we always do a countdown 6 to 1. So the point of this list is going to be 6 records from my collection that, as far as I'm concerned, kind of best sums up that subgenre. Now, you already know metal is divided into subgenres, and then from there into subgenres. It gets very complex for those of you who are not familiar with it as much. So we're going to be getting into just a few subgenres, 6 of them to be exact. And like I said, these are albums in my collection that I thought, you know what, when I think of that subgenre, this album really does represent it well. So for number 6, we're going to be talking about thrash metal. Now, thrash metal, of course, first bands that actually come to mind are bands like Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax, Slayer, the big 4. However, when I think of thrash as a sound, not only then, but also listening to new bands that are coming out and consider them thrash bands, I don't necessarily think of, oh, they sound like Metallica or they sound like Megadeth. What I do hear a lot of is Exodus. Exodus is one of the first thrash bands. In fact, Exodus is where Kirk Hammett of Metallica comes from. He started out in this band, and these guys kind of helped define that Bay Area sound. This is the Fabulous Disaster album, which actually came out in 1989. But of course, they were out, throughout the whole 80s. They were around longer than Metallica. Actually helped Metallica kind of get established in the Bay Area, and their guitar tones seem to really have a big influence on even modern bands that are just now coming out. So the thing about thrash music is it's very aggressive, unapologetically aggressive, fast-paced, made to get you feeling like in the mood to just throw fists, and of course that's where moshing comes from, is from the thrash bands. The guitar tones are very crunchy, a little bit of mid-tone sound to Exodus. Really not a whole lot of low end, but enough to make it, like I said, really crunchy sounding, and it kind of fits their aggressive style. This album, like I said, I'm hearing a lot of newer bands that they come out and I go, wow, their guitar tones really remind me a lot of Exodus as far as new thrash bands go. So I really feel like, as far as my collection, I don't hear that as much in other bands. I don't really get a whole lot of bands where I'm like, oh, this sounds a lot like Megadeth. Even though we know Megadeth and Metallica have had huge influences on other bands. I just feel like as far as the genre of thrash, Exodus, definitely a great choice. Now, don't hate me for talking about this category, but we got to add in some glam, and I'm going to toss in this one. Poison's Look What the Cat Dragged In. If you're not familiar with this, yeah, those are dudes. Yeah. Glam metal as a genre really was influenced by some of the glam music from the 70s, David Bowie, of course, and then New York Dolls. I think sound-wise, of course, there's probably even a lot of like Cheap Trick, bands like that in there. And even bands like Kiss and stuff, because of course glam bands are going to sing more about partying and sex and chicks. Even though they look like chicks, they still were trying to score chicks. Glam is one of the few categories in all of music that I can think of that is really defined by the look. If you take away all the makeup, what they are is a hard rock band. And Poison definitely took advantage of the whole makeup and going to the extreme. And they were really very bubblegum rock, very catchy, radio friendly. Of course, a lot of huge hits from this band. And this album really got them started on it. So yeah. I'd say that pretty well is a really good representation of what glam would be right there. All right, so let's wash the taste out of your mouth of that glam with a little bit of death metal. And I'm going to go with, now I know you probably think I'm going to pick a death album because that is one of my favorite death metal bands, but they had their own evolution eventually even getting more into progressive kind of style of death metal. But when I think of old school death metal and yet still prominent today, I think of Jungle Rot. Jungle Rot is one of those bands. They're really a no-frills band with the exception of musicianship. Death metal bands in general, that was kind of their thing. They stripped away all the image, but they still had an image. I mean, it was black t-shirts, jeans, and tennis shoes, whatever. But they took away all the spikes and leather. They took away the makeup. They took all that kind of stuff together. And then death metal took thrash and made it a little darker. Of course, more gravelly death style vocals. In fact, really, that's where we kind of get the name death metal has to do with the vocal styles. However, also would be the themes of the music. I mean, as you can see, this album, What Horrors Await, it's very violent looking album cover, and death metal definitely takes the violent storytelling to an extreme. All of the songs in death metal bands are almost always about something horrific, some kind of terrible way to die. And that was one of the areas where Chuck Schuldiner was taking death into a different direction. They started talking a little bit more politics and a lot of science actually involved in their kind of progressive nature. So Jungle Rot is a band that is very steady paced. It's very aggressive and fast, but it's not so fast that you can't get into it. And that's kind of what I like. I feel like it's a good representation. This is a 2018 release, whereas death metal's been out since the 80s, mid 80s, and it has probably death metal as a subgenre has really broken into more subgenres than any others, because you've got progressive death metal, you've got death doom, you've got extreme metal, deathcore. There's just a lot of different kinds of death metal, and a lot of it to me sounds the same, but I can hear the differences as far as the musicianship. But you can definitely tell that death metal is something that it's kind of one of those things where the true fans, they kind of like really appreciate the old school. Of course, I talked about the new albums by Benediction, and death metal is kind of one of those things where it's like the fans, we really want to see it kind of stick to its roots a lot. But like I said, lots of cool stuff that it's breaking off into anyway. So Jungle Rot, if you want to see what death metal sounds like, I'd say this is a pretty good one this is a good one in my collection that I thought would be a good representation. All right, how about some progressive? I got to find a way to work Rush into it, right? Here's Rush, Hemispheres. Now, okay, so if you're not sure about what progressive music is, basically it is a true musician's wet dream. Some people, when they write songs, they're really just about the song itself, and maybe they're about the hooks, and so they're focusing more on what the vocals can do and writing some very simple chord structures. Whereas progressive bands, they are taking their musical skills to the extremes. They want to see how technical they can get with their playing. They want to change up time signatures. Progressive music, not good for dancing, because once you find that beat, it changes. And that's part of their way of challenging themselves. When a musician hears progressive music and hears something mind-blowing, they're the ones that stop you when you didn't think you heard anything special. They go, did you hear that? That was amazing. I've always felt that with Geddy Lee. Geddy Lee's bass playing has always been phenomenal. I know a lot of people think that only the 70s Rush was progressive, but they were actually progressive even in the 80s, 90s, and in the 2000s. It's just that they didn't have anything to prove anymore, so they kind of kept it as more tasty bits here and there. And there was definitely a lot of those tasty bits. But this was definitely the height of their progressive style as far as technicality goes. And then, of course, later on, other bands that are a little bit more metal would come along and take the influence from a band like Rush and then expand on it. Bands like Dream Theater, who were huge in the 90s as far as progressive metal goes. And then, you could take that on further, even bands like Opeth, who is actually more of the death metal band, but more on that progressive death metal band. I told you they broke them into a lot of categories. And then even more modern ones like Sons of Apollo, where it's just phenomenal playing, and just taking that technical skill as far as they can. And, you know, we're getting more and more female fans, but it used to be like Rush, like you would see no chicks at a Rush concert. But fortunately, that is changing, and it's good to see people appreciate true musical skill and genius. Rush, three geniuses. Love this album, Hemispheres. All right, for number 2, let's talk about black metal. Now, when we think of black metal, most people immediately think of what's referred to as the second wave of black metal, and that means what we know got started in Norway, bands like Mayhem and Dark Throne and Emperor. I don't really consider Venom a black metal band, even though they had a song called black metal. I think most listeners don't. I think you could argue that there are, you know, of course, a lot of influences, but when I think of black metal, like most of you, I do think of usually what started in Norway, as far as, like I said, Mayhem and Dark Throne and this band and Immortal and others, and a lot of that was really tin can kind of production, and it did evolve eventually into more of a big production. A lot of the old school fans really hate anything with a really good production to it. I like this album in particular. It kind of sits on that edge. Now, the thing about black metal that you got to remember is that it is by nature a very cold sound, and it does really generate a feeling of that cold, you know, that Nordic winter. It really brings about that feeling of that kind of cavernous sound to it, buried a lot of times in effects. Very mid-range guitars. There's not a whole lot of low end in black metal. However, there is a lot of what's called blast beats, really fast, aggressive drum style. And that's kind of a common thing, like I said, with this, and you know, it's even becoming more common in death metal as well. But this album in particular, like I said, the albums before this, they were still a little bit more of that rough production, and this started to get a little bit better. Emperor never really went for a big production like Dimmu Borgir sort of a band, but they've always been that set of, I guess, like I said, more of a cavernous sound, and so these guys kind of sat right on the border for it. I love Emperor. I always thought Ishan was just a musical genius, a bit progressive himself actually, but anyway, black metal for me, this in my collection, this album definitely sits well as the representative of that subgenre. All right, and finally for number 1, we're going to talk about power metal. And power metal, I think a great representation would be Iron Maiden and Power Slave. Now, of course, Iron Maiden is also part of Nuabum, that's the new wave of British heavy metal, which is, I don't know if that's necessarily a genre of music as much as just a wave of metal. I don't think I could necessarily come up with one band that I thought really represented Nuabum. But these guys were a part of that, of course. It was the music that was coming out of England that really influenced a lot of people like Metallica. And so Iron Maiden was one of those bands, but they definitely fit in the category of power metal and being one of the bands that really originated that style and influenced so many others. Later on, the 90s, Iced Earth was definitely a big one. After that, bands like Nightwish actually was another good one. And then even recent bands like War Kings and Powerwolf. Basically, what makes up power metal is usually a band that's vocal style is very operatic. Clean vocals typically, not always. Sometimes it'd be a little bit on the raspy side. And even maybe incorporate bits of death here and there nowadays. But for the most part, it's definitely clean vocals, very strong, powerful, in-your-face vocal styles. Of course, Bruce Dickinson, I mean, you can't get much better than that, right? The other thing about, it's usually a big production and also lyrical content. A lot of times it has to do with stories. Power metal doesn't really do like the whole political thing, and it's not just based on some kind of terrible way to die. It's usually stories, and quite often is history based. And of course, Iron Maiden, really good for that. I've always said that I learned more about world history from Iron Maiden than I ever did in high school in history class. And of course, as you can guess, Power Slave, even the song Power Slave itself, has to do with a Egyptian slave and what it was like to have to work for the pharaohs in building their kingdom. So Iron Maiden's always been good for that sort of thing. A lot of great songs that have built on, whether it be on actual history or whether it be on other people's stories, books, fantasy stories, mythology. A lot of mythology involved in there. So anyway, that kind of sums up what power metal is about, and this album definitely sounds like power metal. Alright, so even though it's not a particular order to why I did this, let's go ahead and do the countdown. Number 6, representing thrash metal, I'm going with Exodus, Fabulous Disaster. Number 5, representing glam metal, Poison, Look What the Cat Dragged In. Number 4, representing death metal, Jungle Rot, What Horrors Await. Number 3, representing prog, Rush, Hemispheres. Number 2, representing black metal, Emperor, Anthems to the Welkin at Dusk. And number 1, representing power metal, Iron Maiden's Power Slave. Alright, so that's going to be it for now. I'd like to know what albums in your collection do you feel best represent these categories, maybe some other categories as well. There's actually quite a few, but you know, this is called 6 records, so I just picked 6. Until next time, keep the horns up, keep the needle down.